The human population. We are finally here to some very controversial topics. The human population size, affluence, resource consumption, they all are interrelated and they all impact the environment. Probably one of the best examples that most of my students know is China. China is striking with more than 1.3 billion people. That's almost 20% of all humans live in China. All right, we've already observed that family income, as it increases, people tend to have fewer children. In fact, we know that there's a link between higher levels of education and affluence among females in particular. It's the girls that have a lower birth rate and they are affected by education levels. So as the educational levels of women increase, women enter the workplace, fertility generally decreases. Even in developed countries where there's a increase slightly after hitting this apparent low point that we talked about, women have fewer children than those in developing countries still. And educated and working women tend to have even fewer children than anyone else. No one told me this when I was planning a family. Anyway, there's this delay in having children because of the demands of school and work. So having a first child at an older age means that women are likely to have fewer children over the course of their lifetime. Well, I guess some women anyway. Not necessarily me. But women with more education and income also tend to have more access to information about methods of birth control. And it's more likely for them to interact with a partner as an equal, and they may choose to practice a family planning method without this constant reminder that there's a head of household. So family planning is this regulation of the number of offspring and spacing them through their deliveries by the use of birth control methods. And when women have this option to use this family planning, crude birth rates tend to drop. This shows you how female education levels definitely correlate with a crude birth rate. In Ethiopia, for instance, women with a secondary school education or higher tend to have families with a 2.0, which is their replacement level is 2.0, replaces mom and dad, and whether everyone is uneducated, then their replacement is at 6.1. They'll have 6 plus more children. So there have been many examples of effective family planning campaigns over the last few decades. In the 80s, I know that Kenya had one of the largest population growths in the entire world. I mean, it was at 8. But by 1990, we had got it down to 4. That's half of the rate where they were. And Kenya's government achieved those dramatic results by implementing what they call an active family planning campaign. And this campaign began in the late 70s, and it just encouraged smaller families. It was advertised to both directly men and women simultaneously, and it emphasized that overpopulation basically led to both unemployment and harming the environment. So these ads promoted condom use in Kenya, in this country, and so they basically cut their birth rate in half. All right, Thailand is another example of a successful use of family planning campaigns that lowered its growth rate entirely. So in the early 1970s, the National Population Policy encouraged married couples to use birth control. So these contraceptives that were in use went from about 15% to 70%. And that was within a short period of time of 15 years. So their population rate fell from this 3.2 in the early 70s to 1.6%. So they weren't even replacing their parents about 15 years later after the advertisement of contraceptives. But today, Thailand's growth rate is at 0.6. So they did a good job in slowing it down. That's pretty much the lowest in Southeast Asia. And some of that credit that they get is this huge success meaningful reduction in growth rate was extremely creative and, charismatic by the government. But at the same time, it got a great deal of attention because this religious country was handing out condoms in public places and shopping malls, and they were everywhere and they were available to everyone. But if that's what they wanted to succeed in, they definitely did. Population size, economic development, and consumption interact and they influence the environment in dramatic ways. Both population size and the amount of resources that each person uses is a critical factor in determining the impacts of humans and what the impacts they have on the planet. Every human acts and takes a toll on the environment. I mean, we eat, we drink, we generate waste, we consume products. So eventually, relatively simple foods that are even like beans and rice, they still require energy and water and minerals from the ground and resources and energy and heat to prepare. So raising and preparing meat requires even more resources. Animals require crops to feed them, as well as water and energy and buildings to house them. Even homes and manufacturing cars and making clothing, all these consumer products all require energy, food, water, and other resources. So there are many human activities that contribute to overall environmental degradation, not just population growth. But both population and economic development contribute to the consumption of resources and to human impact on the environment. And in this next part, I want to talk about, we'll examine how relationships among population size, economic development, and resource consumption, how that influences the environment. So we're going to look at more than just a local concern, but we'll look closely at locals and urban and like global impacts on how that happens through resource use. So China and India, I feel like I'm picking on China a lot, are by far the largest nations in the world, okay? Only 3 of the 12 most populous countries are what we consider developed. And if you look at this diagram here, population size is actually along the y-axis in the millions. And so you can see the difference between developed and developing countries. Not every developing country is growing out of control in population size. When it comes to our past and our future, population growth in developed countries has mostly ceased, while that of developed nations is slowing. So it's expected to continue beyond that point in 2050, though. If you're looking at this diagram here, where it's been broken down into India, China, the whole African continent, and other developing countries, and then we, the United States, are at the bottom of developing nations, over time, the human population size has grown in billions, and we can now contribute to that growth to certain areas.